It was the middle of February, and the kind of winter storm you only see in the movies had rolled into our small, mountain-adjacent town. I worked as a delivery driver for a local hardware store, which meant braving snow-covered roads no matter how bad it got. On this particular day, the snowstorm had started with a light, persistent fall in the morning, but by noon, it was a full-blown blizzard. The roads were empty except for a few brave souls, and even they didn't stay out for long. My last delivery of the day was to an address I didn't recognize, far on the outskirts of town. The order was for a kerosene heater, batteries, and a few other items that screamed emergency preparedness. It seemed odd, but given the storm, I figured someone had just decided to play it safe. The GPS had a hard time tracking my location as I left the main road and entered the forested backroads. The snow was so thick it muffled everything, turning the world into a cold, silent void. The trees grew denser, their branches weighed down by snow, and the road narrowed to a single icy lane. My phone's service bars flickered, and then I lost all signal entirely. Eventually, I spotted the house. It was small, almost a cabin, with a crooked chimney puffing smoke into the freezing air. There were no other houses around, just endless trees and snow. The porch light flickered weakly, the only sign of life in the blizzard. I parked the van and grabbed the delivery box, trudging through the knee-deep snow toward the door. I knocked 3 times, but there was no answer. The windows were dark, and the silence felt oppressive. I knocked again, harder this time. Just as I was about to leave the box on the porch and head back to the van, the door creaked open. An old man stood in the doorway, his face lined and weathered, his eyes dull and tired. He wore a thick sweater and a scarf, even indoors. "You're here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Come in." I hesitated. "I'll just leave this here." "No," he interrupted, his voice firm. "Bring it inside. It's too cold out here." Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The cabin was dimly lit, with a single oil lamp casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air smelled faintly of kerosene and something metallic. The old man gestured to a small table near the fireplace. "Set it there." I did as he asked, eager to leave. But as I turned to go, he stopped me. "The storm will get worse," he said. "You should stay." I forced a polite smile and shook my head. "Thanks, but I need to get back to town." He didn't argue, just nodded slowly. "Be careful," he said, his gaze lingering on me as I left. By the time I got back to the van, the snow was coming down so hard I could barely see. The tires struggled to grip the icy road as I reversed, the van's headlights illuminating the swirling white abyss. I had only made it a mile down the road when I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the van skidding to a halt just feet away from the person. They didn't move, didn't react to the blinding headlights. They were wrapped in a heavy coat, their face obscured by a hood. I honked the horn, but they stayed still, their head tilting slightly as if studying me. "Come on," I muttered, my breath fogging up the windshield. Finally, the figure turned and walked into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I waited a moment, my heart pounding, before driving on. But the further I went, the worse the storm became. The road was barely visible, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few minutes later, my headlights illuminated something up ahead. My heart sank as I realized it was the same cabin. The same flickering porch light. Somehow, I had looped back to where I started. "No way," I whispered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I checked the GPS, but it was still dead. My phone, too, had no service. I turned the van around and tried again, taking what I thought was a different road. But after another mile, I found myself back at the cabin. The porch light blinked twice. I parked the van, my hands shaking, and got out. The snow was so thick I could barely see the cabin, but as I approached, the door opened on its own. Inside, the old man was sitting by the fire, his back to me. "I told you," he said without turning around. "The storm doesn't let anyone leave." I backed away, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and shiny. It was a key. "Take this," he said, holding it out to me. "It's the only way." I didn't want to take it. Something about the key felt wrong, but I was desperate to escape. I grabbed it and bolted back to the van, not bothering to look back. This time, the key turned the ignition on the first try. I floored it, the tire spinning in the snow before catching. The headlights cut through the blizzard, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. But then, just as I reached the edge of the woods, the van stalled. The lights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. When I woke up, I was back at the cabin, lying on the floor near the fire. The old man was gone, and the delivery box was sitting next to me, unopened. The storm outside had stopped, but the air inside the cabin was colder than ever. I left without looking back, driving straight to town. When I reached the hardware store, I told my manager what had happened. He looked at me like I was crazy. "That cabin's been empty for years," he said. "No one's lived there since the fire." I didn't argue. I just left the box on the counter and walked out, hoping to forget what had happened. But I couldn't forget the key. It was still in my pocket. It was late January, and I was driving back to my hometown after visiting a friend who lived a few hours away in a small mountain community. The drive was supposed to be straightforward, with long stretches of winding roads cutting through snow-covered forests. I checked the weather before leaving, and while a snowstorm was predicted later that evening, I figured I had plenty of time to make it home. By the time I reached the halfway point, the sky had darkened to a steel gray, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. The storm hit faster than I expected, turning the road into a slick, treacherous mess. My car's heater struggled against the cold as I crept along, my headlights barely piercing the swirling white haze. It was just past 8 p.m. when I saw him. The man was standing on the shoulder of the road, wrapped in a long coat with a hood pulled low over his face. He didn't have a car, no sign of a vehicle anywhere nearby. He stood perfectly still, one arm outstretched, his thumb pointing upward in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. I hesitated. Picking up a hitchhiker in the middle of a snowstorm wasn't something I would normally do, but something about him seemed desperate. The idea of leaving him out in the freezing cold didn't sit right with me. I slowed the car and rolled down the passenger window. "You need a ride?" I called out. He nodded silently and climbed in without a word. As he settled into the seat, I noticed how pale his hands were, almost blue, like he'd been out in the cold for far too long. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the awkward silence. "Just down the road," he said, his voice low and raspy. I nodded and focused on the road ahead, the wipers struggling against the relentless snow. The man didn't say much, and every time I glanced at him, he was staring straight ahead, his hood still pulled low over his face. For the first few miles, I chalked up his odd behavior to the cold and the storm. But as the minutes ticked by, an uneasy feeling began to settle in my chest. Something about him felt wrong. His stillness, the way he avoided looking at me, the faint metallic smell that seemed to cling to him, it all felt off. We passed a sign indicating a rest stop 2 miles ahead. "Do you want me to drop you there?" I asked. "No," he replied curtly. "Keep going." His tone was sharp, almost commanding, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my pulse quickening. The silence in the car grew heavier, broken only by the sound of the tires crunching through the snow. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even though he never turned his head. About 10 minutes later, the man suddenly spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I glanced at him, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out something small and shiny. I tensed, my mind racing, but when he opened his hand, I saw it was just a coin, a tarnished silver dollar. He held it up, turning it slowly between his fingers. "Have you ever heard the story of the ice road?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. "They say it appears during storms like this," he continued, his tone almost conversational. "A road that takes you places you're not meant to go." My stomach churned as his words sank in. "That's just a story," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "Maybe," he said, slipping the coin back into his pocket. "But you'll see soon enough." The road ahead was almost invisible, swallowed by the storm. I was about to ask what he meant when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The headlights illuminated a sign on the side of the road, "Welcome to Cold Hollow." But Cold Hollow wasn't on this route. It wasn't even a real place. I'd lived in the area my whole life and never heard of it. "I think we're lost," I said, my voice shaking. The man chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. "No," he said. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." The unease in the car was suffocating as I drove on, the snowstorm showing no signs of letting up. The forest lining the road grew denser, the trees looming like dark sentinels. My GPS was useless, its screen frozen on the same location, and my phone had no signal. "Turn here," the man said suddenly, pointing to a narrow, unmarked road that branched off the main one. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to keep going. "Why?" "Because it's the only way out," he said, his voice firm. Against my better judgment, I turned onto the road. It was barely more than a path, the snow so thick it was almost impassable. The headlights caught glimpses of the woods, gnarled branches, patches of ice, but no signs of life. As we continued, the man grew quieter, his presence feeling heavier with each passing moment. Then, without warning, he spoke again. "You should stop here," he said. "What? Why?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "Just stop," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. I pulled over, my hands trembling. The man opened the door and stepped out, disappearing into the blizzard without another word. For a moment, I sat there, too stunned to move. Then I saw it. Through the swirling snow, faint lights flickered in the distance, like lanterns swaying in the wind. They seemed to move closer, their glow casting eerie shadows on the trees. I locked the doors, my heart pounding as the lights surrounded the car, hovering just beyond the reach of the headlights. A soft tapping sound came from the window, and I turned to see a figure standing there, its face obscured by a thick hood. It raised a hand, beckoning me to open the door. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning on the icy road before catching. The lights followed, darting between the trees, their movement unnatural and frantic. I drove blindly, the road twisting and turning, until I finally burst out of the woods and onto a main road. When I looked back, the lights were gone. The forest was still, the snow falling softly. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the wheel tightly, and didn't stop until I was parked safely in my driveway. I never saw the man again, but sometimes, on snowy nights, I think about his warning. I don't know where that road would have taken me, but I know one thing for certain. I should never have stopped. 3 winters ago, I took a solo trip to the mountains to clear my head after a tough breakup. I rented a small cabin advertised as a quiet retreat, tucked away in a place called Frost Hollow Lane. The pictures showed a cozy little place with a stone fireplace and a view of the snowy woods. It sounded perfect. The drive to the cabin was long and uneventful, but the scenery was beautiful. Snow-covered pines lined the narrow road, and the mountains rose like silent guardians in the distance. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised, charming and secluded. It felt like a fresh start. But that feeling didn't last long. The first night was peaceful. I cooked dinner, lit a fire, and curled up with a book. The quiet was almost unnerving at first, no distant hum of traffic, no neighbors' voices, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the warmth and silence. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a trail leading from the cabin into the woods, so I bundled up and set off with my camera in hand. The forest was beautiful, the snow untouched except for the occasional animal track. I followed the trail for about a mile before I noticed something odd. The footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but the size and spacing were all wrong. They were larger than any human footprints I'd ever seen, and the distance between each step was unnaturally long. They weren't fresh, the edges were softened by the wind, but they seemed to follow the same path I was on, heading deeper into the woods. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the snow, but the unease lingered. I snapped a few photos of the trail and turned back toward the cabin, glancing over my shoulder more than once. By the time I got back, the sun was setting, and the temperature had dropped significantly. The cabin felt like a sanctuary, warm and welcoming, but that night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound, branches creaking, the wind whistling, felt amplified, like the forest itself was alive. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of knocking. It was faint, almost polite, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding, and listened. The knock came again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from the front door. I crept to the window and peeked out, but the porch was empty. The snow was falling steadily, and there were no footprints leading to the door. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, when the knock came again. This time, it wasn't from the door. It was coming from the window. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just outside. They were tall and motionless, their face obscured by the frost-covered glass. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there like a shadow etched into the snow. My hand shook as I reached for my phone, but of course, there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the reception hours ago. I grabbed the fire poker and approached the window cautiously. But when I pulled the curtain aside, the figure was gone. The rest of the night was a blur of anxiety and restless pacing. I checked every lock, every window, but there was no sign of anyone. By morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, a combination of isolation and exhaustion. But then I saw the footprints. They circled the cabin, weaving in and out of the trees, their size and spacing identical to the ones I'd seen on the trail. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the porch, as if whoever, or whatever, had been standing there had simply vanished. I tried to shake it off and spent the day inside, reading and keeping the fire going. But as the sun set, the sense of unease returned. I couldn't stop glancing at the windows, half expecting to see that figure again. That night, the knocking came back. It was louder this time, more insistent, and it wasn't just at the door. It moved from window to window, the sound echoing through the cabin. At one point, it came from the back door, then the roof, then the front porch again. It was like whatever was out there was circling, testing the barriers, waiting for an opening. I huddled by the fire, gripping the poker like a lifeline. The knocking stopped suddenly, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, until I heard the faintest sound. Footsteps. Inside the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, moving from room to room. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were getting closer. I pressed myself against the wall, the firelight flickering wildly as the shadows danced around me. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response, just the faint creak of the floorboards. Then, from the darkness, I saw it. A hand. It was pale and elongated, the fingers impossibly long, wrapping around the edge of the doorframe. My stomach churned as the hand pulled back, and a figure stepped into the light. It was tall, its body gaunt and unnaturally thin, with skin so pale it seemed to glow. Its face was featureless, smooth, and blank like porcelain, except for two hollow, black voids where its eyes should have been. It tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it smiled. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was running through the snow, the freezing air burning my lungs. The forest was a blur of shadows and white, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots and the pounding of my heart. When I finally reached the main road, a passing truck stopped to help me. The driver was a kind old man who didn't ask questions, though I could see the concern in his eyes. He took me back to town, and I didn't look back. I never returned to Frost Hollow Lane. When I tried to contact the rental agency to report what had happened, they claimed they had no record of the cabin. They even suggested I might have the wrong location, but I knew better. I still dream about that figure sometimes, its hollow eyes and twisted smile haunting me in the dark. And every winter, when the snow falls thick and the nights grow long, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to knock.